Hey everyone, welcome to episode 2 of the Wing Magma podcast, the podcast where I discuss all the music that I'm involved in, from music that I'm playing, music that I'm writing, music that I'm listening to, and music that I talk to my friends about. This week's episode is largely going to be based around a conversation that I recorded with a friend of mine called Alex. Alex introduced me to a book called 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die. He has read the book cover to cover and he has listened to all 1001 albums on the list. It's an incredible journey to go on, one that I'm on myself, and I'm really jealous that he's done it. It takes quite a commitment to do it, and he's learned a lot from it, and obviously heard a lot of music that he wouldn't have heard otherwise as a result of going on that journey. And it's just a really great conversation about the things that he picked up on, the things that he learned, and a conversation that we've threatened to have many times, so I'm very happy that we got to have that. In terms of a general update as to what I've been doing and what I'm up to, I'm writing a lot more than I have done for a very long time. I've got my setup going in the garage, where I'm doing a lot of bits and pieces. I'm putting out daily ideas on my Instagram feed if anybody fancies having a listen. All they are is little phone recordings that I do just to capture an idea, and some of them date back quite a while. I've figured out how to add footage to them so that they're a little bit easier to digest on Instagram. They're only like 1 minute kind of little snippets, but it's good that those ideas are getting an airing. Usually from time to time they do end up in a song or something like that, but more often than not I don't know how to progress them from a little idea, so they'll just kind of live on my phone and they do get forgotten about, which is it's not the best, and I'm like, it's good that they've found their platform, and it's good that, I don't know, it reminds me of some of the ideas that I've had and put on the shelf, so I can write more music off the back of it. So in other music related news, Bronze Age has come back from our Christmas break, and we're straight back into writing. We're going to be setting up our rehearsal studio to capture ideas a little bit better. At the moment, what we do is, we'll play through an idea, we'll play it round and round and round, and then all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, and then eventually somebody will get out their phone, hit record, and we'll share it in our chat group on WhatsApp. What that eliminates, though, are all the good ideas along the way. So even in the practice that we just had, we started off with an idea and it had all of this momentum and it had some really great stuff. And as we started to take it down a path we thought was the right thing to do, something got lost. And it was just like the energy of the original idea started to disappear, and it's just like, well, what were we doing? I don't know, because it's out in the universe now. Like, we didn't capture it. So hopefully what we're going to be doing is just hitting record, play, and then go back and review and pick the best bits and stuff like that. So that's going to be really, really cool. We've had a couple of gig offers for Bronze Age, which we've turned down because we just want to crack on with the writing. We can gig, we have gigged, but it comes at the expense of new material at the moment. So we just want to get back in the saddle. We've learnt the old songs again, which is great, but this was always about new music, so it's good to kind of get back into that. And in coming back to the stuff that I'm doing for Wing Magma, I'm I'm planning on going into the garage this evening to do a little bit work to try a few ideas with the grandmother Moog that I've got set up behind me for those that can see me on the YouTube version. I bought it a while ago and I've done some cool stuff with it. It's really easy to get lost, and you know, in a synthesizer universe, you can actually run a guitar through it, so it's almost like a massive effects pedal. So I've not done it yet. I've seen that you can do it on YouTube. I'm going to give that a go and see what weird and wonderful things fall out of the back of it. So yeah, lots of new music being written, really exciting time, and it won't be long before I start sharing that with everyone. So let's cut to the conversation with Alex around 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die. Really great conversation, amazing guy. Yes, here we go. I can't click with that hand. Hey guys, I'm joined by my long-term friend and part-time lover, Alex Warwick. Alex and I have worked together for just over 10 years now at Eiffel Presentations. Alex is a very talented designer, and he's one of our creative directors. But we're not here to talk about that particularly. We are here to talk about a book that Alex has introduced me to, and he's introduced to a lot of people in our office, and subsequently I've introduced it to a bunch of people, and it is called 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die. So probably a good place to start is who introduced you to it, and how did you come to know about the book?
Okay, well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, my right. Part-time lover, Lloyd.
This is just like work. This is how we spent 2 years talking to each other. Sorry, go on.
But in terms of the book, like, if you don't know, it's part of a series. So there's books. I've actually got one behind me called 1001 Songs to Hear Before You Die, but there's also 1001 Films to Watch Before You Die.
Have you got all of them?
I haven't got the films one, but I have got the.
Seems like a real.
I've got the song one right there.
Oh, awesome!
But the thing is, with films, obviously, you need to find the films, which is going to be a huge pain because it's not as easy as a streaming service to listen to music. And with songs, I found that I never really got into it because the songs were also quite difficult to find. But not only that, because they're one song at a time, you end up spending a lot of time going to the next song or trying to make a queue up and things like that. Whereas the albums, you can, especially during lockdown, which is when I started this book, you can basically just put the albums on, you can play it, it carries on for 50 minutes, an hour, however long the album is, and then you go to the next one, etc., etc. And it's sort of, as you can imagine, you can do other things, you can work, you can focus whilst going through this book. And obviously 1001 albums takes a long time to get through it. So where did I find it? Basically just scrolling around on Amazon and just thought, do you know what? I'm in my own office for however long. I'd like to have my own music just playing in the background. Let's go on a bit of a journey, starting in 1955, I believe. And just go in through all of the albums and see how long it takes.
So, like, the way that you sold it to me is more of a challenge. So I think when we first started talking about it, I think there's a website. Well, I might have to find it and put a link, because you can check to see how many albums you've already listened to. So you can tick them off, can't you, as you're going along. And I remember looking at it and thinking, you know, I like to think I'm quite well read in that department. I think I had about 180, something like that I'd listened to, and I was thinking, Jesus, that's not as big a fraction of it as I would have liked. But
there's a lot in there, certainly. There's a lot which I didn't know about, and I've jotted down a few of my key albums as well as I was going through, and you know, I started this book. I basically labeled up the date of every single album in there. So I think it starts with May 2020 and ends...
sorry, the date that you listened to them.
Well, yeah, the date that I started listening to them from the very start of the book, and it goes all the way. So
has your copy got loads of notes and...
Yeah, I've just been writing with pencil pretty much all the way through.
Amazing.
And I put a star next to the albums that I really like, or the ones that, you know, I'd want to listen to again, which I didn't particularly know about too much. But essentially, I ended the book at the end of January last year. So it took me just under, well, it took me a year and, I don't know, 9 months or something to go through.
Oh, right. I thought it took you like 2 years and 9 months. Because so I started doing it and I had a lot of momentum to begin with. For whatever reason, I think, do you know what it was? I think I started to not cheat because I didn't. So right, when I say cheat, right, give the viewers a little bit of context. There is a bit of a challenge that Alex has set, and I think this helps you to get the very, very most out of the book. Is that you've got to listen to every single album. You can't skip any of them, and you have to listen to them in order. And the kind of what you then get as you listen to it in order is the evolution of pop music, essentially. Yeah. And when you reach certain kind of landmark landmark albums, like they have so much more significance. And so I started this last year. I'm looking up here because I've got it there. I started it Christmas last year and I went through to about March. But when I say I started to cheat, I'd find the album and I'd put it on, but I might not get through the whole thing. And then I'd move to the next one if it was a boring album or something like that. And I've started doing it again. And you've got... The albums don't mean as much unless you read the foreword. So each album comes with a bit of context anyway. So you can listen to the album and you can appreciate it in your own capacity. But then there's, you know, like each album has a little bit of a backstory and it will go through the situation that it was in, you know, like what was the political situation at the time, you know, all of those kind of things.
Yeah, definitely. And I think to your point, I set myself the challenge, you're right, that I wouldn't skip anything. And so all the way through, I made sure that I did my best to not skip a single track. I know there was a Christmas album by Phil Spector in the 60s, which I bypassed just because it was about July when I got to that. So I thought, I just can't take that. I'll come back to that one. And there was also maybe a very small handful which weren't on, they weren't on streaming services. So I'd have to find the odd song which I could from YouTube. So a few of them are not that well known albums. They didn't sell a lot of albums.
Did you have to buy any or anything like that? Did you have to order any in?
No, I didn't buy a single one. But I did, as I was going through as well, I set myself another challenge as I was going through the book, which was putting together a playlist on Spotify of one song off every single album in the book. And initially, at the very start, my way of thinking was, because there's always those hits that you know all the way through, really. Even on albums that you didn't even know who they were by, you can still tell the songs. So I set myself a task that I wouldn't go for the obvious choices. I'd go for the deep cuts on those albums. But as the years went by, I started there was a few in there which I just liked the big hits. So, you know, my playlist is a little bit, it sort of starts with the deep cuts back in the sort of 50s, 60s, maybe even to the 70s, and then it starts going to the big hits as it goes on.
So you got lazy with your playlist?
A little bit, yeah. But there's actually, I looked today, there's 900 and just under 980 songs in there. So somewhere down the line, I've either missed a couple or they weren't on Spotify. And in the book, I've actually labelled up some red notes, which I've got like little stickers going through the book.
That's so cool.
Basically, that is where the album didn't exist on Amazon Music or Spotify. So I had to try and find like just the odd thing on YouTube for them.
So were there any that you couldn't find?
I think there might be a very small handful, yeah, which I just couldn't find. I found at least one song off of everything in there, but there's probably a small handful of albums that I didn't listen to all the way through. Right. Funnily enough, I've been listening also to another podcast, not to like sell other podcasts, obviously. this is the best one.
Of course.
Of course. But there's a podcast called 1001 Albums Music Club or something like that, 1001 Albums Club on Spotify. And it's basically a small group of people who obviously like their music and whatnot, but they basically spend a week going through one album and then do a podcast every single week.
Oh,
God. They're now, I think they've been going for, I don't know, 6-7 years. I don't know when the first one was, but they're only on album 500, so they're about halfway.
Wow.
But in that podcast, it's actually, the podcast is only sort of 20 minutes, half an hour each one, depending on the album. And it's an American bunch of people as well. They're all similar age, so I think there's a lack of diversity in some of the things that they say. They're very critical over certain things, which I think is a little bit unneeded because that's just the way they think. But ultimately, it is a great podcast. And interestingly, Robert Dimery, who was the guy who wrote the book or was the main person behind it, he actually went on their show recently and was talking about another book. I think it's called Music Quake. But he was talking about the fact that, he had the lion's share of what went into the book. And so trying to pick 1001 albums is like, with any list, is always going to, pee people off. Mm-hmm. So he was sort of, because they were sort of questioning, why isn't this album in there? Why isn't that album in there? He's like, for a start, I'm only human. And secondly, with the blurb, which you said is really important, it is really important because that's an argumentative or that's a way of sort of telling the audience like why this album should be in the book. Instead of just giving you the albums, it's a reason why the albums are in the book. And he basically said he had a team of writers, and if they could persuade him that a certain album from a certain artist was better than another one, he'd be open to the argument, he'd be open to the idea, and he might switch a few around. Interestingly, there's been a few editions of this book, and he was basically saying, because of cost reasons, a lot of the earlier albums in the book, it's a lot more difficult to update those, because they asked the question, obviously, if you're updating this with new editions, surely some albums need to get ditched. And he was basically sort of saying it's only really in the last part of the book that the albums are getting removed and changed. So the first 40 years of music or whatever's in there is basically as it was all the way through because of printing costs. Mm-hmm. But yeah, what he was saying is some of his choices were basically like, you can't get enough of certain artists. So for example, looking at Wikipedia and looking in the back of the book, I know that there's at least 8, maybe 9 David Bowie albums in this book, which is more than anybody else. So obviously he likes David Bowie, which I know you like David Bowie, so you wouldn't have an issue with that.
I do, but I never really think of David Bowie as an album guy. I think of David Bowie as a song guy. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's not to say that I haven't enjoyed his albums. Of course I have, but like, there's usually a lot of stuff to get through on a David Bowie album. They can be quite heavy. But I didn't realize there was 9. That's greedy, surely.
There's 9 David Bowie albums. There's, I think, 7 Beatles albums in there. There's 7 from Bob Dylan, 7 from Morrissey, even 6 from Elvis Costello. So, there's certain types of music which I think Robert Dimery clearly quite liked. And so when you're looking at it, there's always going to be obvious albums that aren't in there that, in your opinion, should be in there. Stone Cold classics, which are just not in the book. And then there's albums which you'll listen to which you think, why the hell is that in there?
Yeah. So I'm not sure if there was any of... I haven't really looked in any great detail to see if there's any like of my personal kind of classics that have been omitted, but there's probably a bunch that I think are just, you know, would certainly be in my version of this book. But
I would say a lot of the older sort of, certainly the big albums, like, you know, obviously the Beatles albums, the Stones albums, you know, those sort of things are obviously in there. You know, a few Elvis albums, things which you'd sort of expect, really. But as it gets to the later years, like my book finishes in 2018, I think, no, 2017 or 2018, my edition. But there's a lot of albums which I would consider classics from the last 15 years that are just not anywhere in this book. And certainly from like my background, you know, I love hip hop. I have done since the mid 90s, and so I know hip hop fairly well. And there's a few classic hip hop albums which are not in there, and others which I wouldn't consider classics in any way, which are. So ultimately, like the guy said, he's only human. You know, he takes people's arguments, and with every list, you take it with a pinch of salt. Ultimately, looking at this in a chronological journey, I got a huge amount out of it, because obviously over 1,001 albums, you're going to find hundreds and hundreds in there that you just haven't listened to. And there's going to be a few in there which just sort of all of a sudden, it's like a light bulb going off in your head going, how did I not know about this before? And, you know, all of a sudden they become some of your favorite albums. And so that's what the key thing of this book is just finding those albums, like just finding those nuggets.
So what would a question that I'll ask later is what are the special ones? But I think so before we get to that bit, I think in terms of the journey, were there any albums that you knew about that took on a different kind of took on new forms listening to them in context, as in like in chronological order, when you hear Sergeant Pepper, you know, for the first time? Or was there any kind of albums that this process changed your opinion of them?
Yeah, one definitely, which I can think about off the top of my head, is Bob Dylan's, the Freewheeling Bob Dylan, or whatever the album's called, something like that. But that album, I think, was 1962 or 1963. I believe it was his second album, and the first album was pretty much an album which never really sold anything. So it's sort of like his big debut, really. And, you know, I know a lot of Bob Dylan. Like, Bob Dylan's part of culture, isn't he? You know, people know Bob Dylan songs, but I've never loved Bob Dylan. I've never really thought he was brilliant, just because we live in an era where there's loads and loads of great singer-songwriters, and they have much better voices than Bob Dylan, and some of them can write really well. And so it took really to get to that album in the book, after all of the jazz in the 50s and a bit of the rock and roll coming through and all of that sort of stuff. And then all of a sudden Bob Dylan hits with this, you know, sort of folky singer-songwriter stuff with amazing lyrics, and it's just a completely different sort of type of music than the stuff that came before it. And you can imagine the impact that an album had on so many singer-songwriters of the future. And so you have a huge amount of new appreciation for an artist like that, because they didn't really follow anybody else. It seemed like they just were themselves. They came out, they did this thing, and it just absolutely blew up. It blew up their career, and everybody who followed them, you know, that was very much a landmark album.
I think I remember coming across that album and thinking pretty much the same. It was like almost like a template for you'd say, yeah, folk singer-songwriters, storytelling with a guitar, you know. the one that really, like, so when I think there's two that stand out for me in terms of changing my perception of them. The first one was the Little Richard album. When that landed, like, you know, you're listening to it, and like you say, I think it's difficult. The first 10 years or so, well, maybe not 10 years, because my book starts in 57. But certainly the first 5 years, there's so much jazz. And it's just like, and you can appreciate it, but it's just kind of, it's treacle. Some of it is just, you know, it's difficult to get through. And even the guitar-based stuff that's there, you know, like Buddy Holly and the Crickets and stuff like that, you can start to hear the foundations of, you know, the rock and roll kind of format. But then Little Richard was just like an alien has landed. Like, you'd never heard such a character, and like this explosion of personality and raw power in his delivery, and you know, it's sizzling, it's distorted, and it's kind of, you feel it, and it's just like, I would never have thought that about Little Richard. Do you know what I mean? Because we've grown up, and he's just been another person in a you know, a torrent of others. But when you hear his
is a what bom boom, like it starts a tutti frutti.
Although the whole album, and another thing is just like, because you hear it in context, you then hit all of his woos. It's like, well, that's where Paul McCartney owes a lot to him. And again, because I probably heard the Beatles first, you don't think of it. You know, I'd never made that comparison until I heard it in that context.
It did seem like he was the template for rock and roll to come. And although there was sort of rock and roll songs before, there was never a rock and roll star like that. You know,
I was hoping that was the word that you were going to say, because that's exactly it. He was the first, felt like the first character, the first rock star.
Yeah.
You know, here I am. So that was really cool. Another one that springs to mind in terms of context was the early Who albums, because I like the Who, and I've got, you know, for me, the Who have got not just their right in time or whatever, they mean something to me, but they were never really for me on the same level as Led Zeppelin, the Beatles. They were part of the tapestry for sure, but again, listening to it in context, the wailing feedback and all of the soundscapes that Pete Townsend used to make, that's, you can hear, oh shit, he was doing that before Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah.
And you know, and then you start to see where Kurt Cobain gets, well, I don't know if Kurt Cobain took direct reference, but do you know what I mean? That kind of raw guitar sound, kind of, you know, you hear it a lot. It's got a lot to answer for, you know. But again, I wouldn't have had I never had that level of respect, because there are far, like you were saying about Bob Dylan, that, you know, there being better singers and arguably better writers, but there's so many better guitar players than Pete Townsend. But Pete Townsend's always in that conversation, and I never really knew why.
Yeah.
Until this process.
I sort of remember having a conversation with you really about the Who, like quite a few years ago, where you were basically comparing them to, say, like Led Zeppelin were a little bit like the Who, but all of the parts of Led Zeppelin were better than all of the parts of the Who.
Yeah.
Like the drummer was slightly better, the guitarist was slightly better. Do you know what I mean?
They're all supremely better in my mind. It's like, but the Who were just like, I don't know, like, I'm sure there'll be people that would disagree with that, but like for me, yeah, they're just.
Yeah, I love the Who. I really do. There's some albums in there as well which I think potentially shouldn't be in there. Like the first Rolling Stones album is in there, which is basically an album of covers.
Yeah.
And you just think, on its own as an album, it's not good enough to be in a list like this. It's only because it's sort of the first of a major band that it's made it into the cut. But when you actually look at the songs, you know, essentially they're just doing blues covers. You know, it's just a bunch of teenage white kids from the UK doing blues numbers. And so you think, should it be in there? Probably not.
I know that I've listened to it, so I'm in 67. Things are getting quite interesting now, but there's loads of stuff in there. It was just like, how is this culturally significant? And I think because I was putting them on because I was trying to get to a certain point in time, and I didn't want to cheat and I didn't want to skip. But I think when you don't have the context, when I started to skip the blurbs, then it started to fall apart.
You definitely need the context, and that's where a few of them sort of probably fell down in my view, because I didn't read all of it. I've probably listened to nearly all of it, like I said, but in terms of reading all the blurb, I haven't been through all the blurb. I have been through quite a chunk of it, but you're right, if you don't read the blurb, you don't know the arguments about why it's in the book in the first place. So it does sort of lose its meaning, and you're just completely basing it on, the music. But yeah, doing it, certainly the journey that you take going from start to finish, you see how, Little Richard evolves into, then you start getting Elvis doing stuff exactly the same. And then you can see how that morphs into sort of the rock music and the poppy stuff that the Beatles were doing and the rock music of the 60s. And then you can see how it gets heavier and heavier into the psychedelic 60s, and once it hits the 70s, it's just sort of all out experimental, and that's where you see this splinter off into a million other genres. And obviously that sort of period, things are evolving at such a fast pace. You can see it in the book, like every single year is just jam-packed full of albums that you can tell have been built firmly on albums from 2 or 3 years ago, and they've made huge strides forward in the way that they do things. So I think certainly by the time sort of punk came out in the sort of late 70s, it probably needed something like that, because it needed a bit of a refresh of the industry. And you can see all this stuff, and it's just amazing to hear it. And then you get the post-punk era, and as it goes into the H, you can hear all the synthesizers start coming in. That then sort of goes into things like the rave culture in the UK. You can see how that sort of goes into Britpop. And all of those artists. You can see how R&B starts forming. You can see hip-hop over time as well, going all the way through from the 80s into the 90s and noughties, and so you can see all these connections all the way through, and it's just amazing to actually do that in order, because that's where you can spot all of these connections.
Oh man, I am gonna definitely crack on with it, because I just know that there's so much more exciting stuff to come. I don't think I've even got 100 albums in yet. So because I'm doing that thing where I star the albums, and I'll probably go through a couple of those on this podcast, and just like maybe chat to you about specific albums, or just kind of read the blurb, talk about specific ones. But like, what are the standouts? What are the standouts that you found on the journey?
I've got a small list actually in front of me. Ones which these are albums which I hadn't heard before. So obviously there's loads of standouts in there which you have heard, and naturally they're very much part of culture. Like for example, the Michael Jackson albums, I could reel off them word for word, pretty much all 3 that are in the book, which I think there should be more than 3, but there's 3. So in terms of albums like that, there's no point in me writing those down. I know those well. But albums which I've spotted throughout, which I didn't know before, there was one called The Wildest by Prima. Prima. Did I have it in front of me? By Louis Prima. So that was one of the first albums in the book, and it instantly just caught my attention, and I just really liked it because obviously it's in the middle of a load of like big band type music and jazz type music, and then you got this Louis Prima who's just all out fun, and you know it's just really really nice music to listen to. And I also I this is the other thing, I noticed the sort of the singer's voice. I sort of recognized it, and I didn't understand where, so I looked it up, and it turns out that he was King Louis from the Jungle Book, like the original Jungle Book.
See, so I always assumed that was Louis Armstrong.
No, yeah, that's the thing. There's no Louis Armstrong in the book, unfortunately.
How about that?
But yeah, so that album really caught my attention. That was one of the ones I sort of started from the 50s into the 60s. There was a Sam Cooke album in there. I know some Sam Cooke. You know, he's obviously really smooth R&B, sort of the template for you know, some of the stuff that went on in the 70s, or the soul singers from the 70s. But Sam Cooke, I'd never really listened to a whole album. I just knew his big songs. You know, back then as well, it's important to know that in this very early era, albums weren't really like a unified set of songs or a running theme or anything like that. It was more just, you know, we've got a hit or two and we need some filler to get it out as an album. So it was very much a singles world back then. It wasn't really an albums world in the 50s and 60s. You know, they had jazz obviously, but albums as a whole were very much singles. But the Sam Cooke Live at the Harlem Club 1963, I listened to that album and it blew my mind. You know,
it's white hot, that gig.
It's such a good live album. It's definitely one of my top 3 probably live albums ever. And I did notice throughout I was going through the book as well that I had an affinity to live albums in there, all of the big ones really. But this one in particular, it didn't actually get released into the mid 80s. So although it's 1963, the record company held on to it for over 20 years because they said it was too raw and it would ruin Sam Cooke's, you know, suit and tie reputation, because it was just such a raw gig. And so nobody actually heard it for a long time, you know, until we were born. So it felt like an R era album as much as it was a 1960s album. But that one definitely blew my mind. You know, and following on from that, just to sort of slightly sidetrack, you know, the live albums that I heard throughout here, some of them I knew fairly well, like James Brown's Apollo, Johnny Cash's albums in Folsom and San Quentin are in here. Frampton Comes Alive is one of my favorites, like Phil at work album will attest to that. Yeah. There's another one, Tom Waits' Nighthawks, which is a great one. Neil Young's Rust Never Sleeps, Thin Lizzy Live and Dangerous, live at the Fillmore East by the Allman Brothers Band. MTV Unplugged by Nirvana. You know, these are all albums which I know fairly well and I love all of them. So yeah, this Sam Cooke one in particular stood out just because I didn't even know it existed. So other particular albums, there's one called Black Monk Time by the Monks in 1966. That felt very punky.
Yeah.
The reason I've started that is because it was very much in an era with obviously the Beatles and other bands around that time, and it felt a little bit more raw and a little bit more edgy and a little bit more aggressive, and the songs were shorter and, you know, quite punchy, and it sounded like it was way before its time when you listen to things chronologically. So yeah, that was an interesting one. I've got down here Isaac Hayes' Hot Buttered Soul. You know, I love soul music generally. I'd never really listened to that album all the way through. It's only got 4 songs, but those 4 songs equate to about 40 minutes. But that is an absolute classic of soul album.
I'm not there yet. You're talking about albums that I've not heard now.
But I listened to that and I just thought, and obviously people of our generation know Isaac Hayes very much from South Park and whatnot, and Shaft, obviously Shaft is quite iconic from back in the 70s, but that Hot Buttered Soul album from 1969, absolute banger. So going forward a little bit, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. Now those are names which sort of appear in the book quite often, not only as a group, but obviously as individuals, Neil Young being probably the most famous out of those four. But they did an album together in 1970 called Deja Vu, which to me is like, it's the sound of what I would consider West Coast California, very melodic, huge amounts of harmonies. The songwriting is just so on point and it just gets you. And there's just, you listen to that album, you're like, yeah, this is how West Coast Californian music should sound. It's amazing. And then there was, I've got down here, Janis Joplin Pearl, 1971. So Janis Joplin, she obviously died 27 years old. She was quite young, very young. She has got a voice which just resonated so well with me. When I listened to the Cheap Thrills album from the 60s, you can hear her voice there. So when she did Pearl in 1971, she's just got a whole album on her own and doing her own thing and her own songs. It's absolutely immense, and I could listen to her voice all day. So that was another one. So again, you obviously know some of these big hits from these artists, but I'd never actually gone through that complete album. A few more, 1973, Isley Brothers, 3+3. And I always thought, I knew of the Isley Brothers, and you sort of think about them as being 60s, sort of that sort of era of sort of an R&B soul.
Jimi Hendrix used to play for the Isley Brothers?
I'm not sure. I don't know on that detail.
Jimi Hendrix used to play with, I'm pretty sure it's the Isley Brothers. Anyway, sorry,
it wouldn't surprise me, because I think the Isley Brothers, certainly on this particular album, 3+3 album, the guitar work is absolutely stellar. But these albums, this particular album, it was done apparently at the same time that Stevie Wonder was doing Inner Visions, and it was done in the same recording studio with a bit of a crossover with the engineers. And they were using a similar synthesizer as well. So some of the stuff that you'll hear on Stevie Wonder's album, you'll probably also hear on this one. But this one's got so much, it's got that sort of funk, progressive, sort of funky soul, a bit of rock with the guitar and some of the music that's being played in there. But it just feels like a million miles away from some of the stuff that they were doing in the 60s. It feels very progressive, and especially when you're going through in a chronological way, when you start to hear those synthesizer sounds coming in with some of those classic harmonies and things like that, it's just, it hits you. I've also got from the 70s, I've got one of the live albums that I mentioned, actually, the other one that I didn't really know of. I knew Tom Waits and I knew his raspy voice, but I'd never really listened to his albums, and there's a few in this book. But this one in particular, Nighthawks at the Diner, 1975, I thought was amazing. I just loved listening to it because it felt really immersive. It felt like you're at a bar and there's a really solid band in the background, and you can hear little clinks of glasses and people chattering in the background. And then you've got Tom Waits with his really sort of low, raspy voice, and he's essentially just doing sort of funny poetry in front of this sort of really tight, jazzy band. And it just makes you feel like you're in the bar with him. So I absolutely love that album for that reason. He's not really singing on it. He's just sort of doing his poetry and doing funny quips and stuff. And I think he had one of the funniest lines as well, I think, from from all of the albums that I listened to, which I can't quite remember off the top of my head. It was something like, it's like I'm so horny. Even the crack of dawn better be careful, or something like that. So it's and that's how he sort of starts off his live show. But it's like
amazing.
Yeah. So there's there's some really funny moments in there, but that album is just great to listen to. The next one on my list is a Steely Dan album called Arja. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. Again, I'd heard of Steely Dan, the odd song. I didn't really know a lot about them at all. I didn't know that there was sort of band who just constantly go through session musicians, and they use a lot of session musicians on their albums going through. So there's not really like a 4-person band as you'd expect, like the Beatles, like that's your 4 sort of thing. It's very much whoever's the best musician at the time comes in and does this particular part. In terms of that album, 1977 it's sort of jazzy rock, I would say. It's fantastically smooth, and the production values are unbelievable on that album. And
so you said Steely Dan. What was the album?
Aja.
Oh, right, yeah, Aja. Okay.
Yeah, that album is there's a few Steely Dan albums in here, but that one in particular is unbelievable. You listen to it, and I can hear like the good thing about albums like that is you can hear, being a bit of a hip hop head, you can hear little snippets of that making its way through the hip hop samples of the 90s and stuff like that, which I thought was amazing as well. The next one is the last one I've got from the 70s, Elvis Costello, this year's model. So this album, like I mentioned earlier, there's 6 Elvis Costello albums in this book, which is far too many Elvis Costello albums. However, this album in particular is so striking. It's very musical. Lyrically, it's very poignant, and it's not messing around in terms of the lyrics of that album and the way he sings them and the sort of music that's going on with it. I think it stands out really. It stands out massively in terms of the other albums going on at that time, because obviously at this point in the 70s, we're in the middle of punk. We're also in the middle of disco albums coming out and all this sort of thing. So to hear Elvis Costello doing his thing, which is very unique, really, on this year's model, I think was just really striking to hear that. Then we go into the 80s. This is where things get, to me, like the 80s. Like I was born in the 80s. To me, Michael Jackson was the 80s for me. This is starting to come up to an era which I sort of have little recollections of music, but to me, up until the 90s, Michael Jackson was music, and everything outside that was secondary. But when I was listening to these albums back, there's a lot of synthesizers in the 80s, and there's a lot of fairly similar type stuff, I would say. Like there's a band ABC with Lexicon of Love, there's Duran Duran and Rio, and there's those sort of albums like being peppered through the 80s, which I'm not a massive fan of, but when you listen to the book in order, you can get it. You can see why they were really big at the time. But I think it's only when you look back with what knowledge you've got now in hindsight that you start to think, do you know what, it's not really for me. But when you're actually looking forward going through, you can see that difference. Violent Femmes. So that album is 1982. I listened to that again the other day. It still sounds fresh, that album. It's they're short songs, they're sort of punky songs, but there's such a unique freshness about it that it doesn't seem to get old, that album. The next one on my list, Welcome to the Pleasure Dome by Frankie Goes to Hollywood. So I know that I mentioned this to you in terms of a song because they did a 14-minute version, I think, of Welcome to the Pleasure Dome. But as an album, I loved that album. It was one of those.
I think I remember you telling me about that when you got there.
Yeah. So I'm not sure when that was. It's probably 18 months back at least.
It was thick lockdown. It was,
yeah, that was.
yeah.
But that album, you know, it's got like 2 Tribes on it, Relax, the Welcome to the Pleasure Dome song. So there's a few albums with a few songs on there which people generally would know, but the whole album is a banger. You know, it really is a good one. Then I've got Tracy Chapman, 1988, with her album. It's one of these which still sounds fresh. Like there's certain albums which, even 30 odd years on, you listen to it and you're like, do you know what, this would still be a hit now. You know, if this got released today, I think people would still really like it. And Lenny Kravitz did an album called Let Love Rule in 1989. Who would have thought, like, Lenny Kravitz was going that long? Like, I obviously remember him from American Woman and those sort of songs, but yeah, he was releasing albums in the 80s, and that one is actually a really great album.
I remember that. I think it's quite a psychedelic video. I seem to, but yeah, I knew of parts of Lenny Kravitz doing bits and bobs like that.
Yeah. So going into the 90s, so I've only got a couple here which I've written down because it's starting to get into an era which, you know, the albums which we really like are albums which we know quite well from that era. You know, we were sort of living through it, and I think if they're not albums which you cottoned onto back then, you're probably less likely to now. You know, so for example, Pulp. I don't like Pulp. You know, I'm never going to like Pulp
because he disgraced Michael Jackson, didn't he? Why would you like him?
Why would I like him? But I didn't like Pulp even back in the height of Britpop. But
you still hold a grudge.
Yeah, I don't like him. But in the 90s, what I've got is Pills, Thrills and Bellyaches by the Happy Mondays. You know, I've got that one down because I know the Stone Roses, like their debut album, and that is an absolute classic. You know, it's definitely probably top 20 all time on my particular list. You know, it's such a stunning album. Well, post that, there's obviously, you've got this sort of ravey type culture going on in the UK. This rave scene. Pills, Thrills and Bellyaches by the Happy Mondays, I think is a great album, you know, and it's one that I didn't know of before, you know, because in that sort of era I think of Primal Scream and Screamadelica, which I also know very well. So, you know, any albums like that I found, I was also gonna love. So that one by the Happy Mondays is a great album. And then I've got the Smashing Pumpkins, Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, 1995. So this was in the mid-90s. Obviously, all around us, everyone was talking about Blur and Oasis and those sort of things. And I think the Spice Girls were just about to come out around that sort of time. And, you know, I started getting into hip-hop with the Fugees. You know, these are all big stars at the time. The Smashing Pumpkins, I think, were quite alternative. And so I think unless you were sort of in the know or maybe a little bit older, because I was only sort of 12 when this album came out, I wouldn't have known about this album at the time. And so when I was going through the book, I knew a few Smashing Pumpkins albums or songs certainly, but listening to that whole album, I absolutely loved it. I love his voice. I love the texture of it. I think it's an absolutely unbelievable album of the mid-90s.
Yeah, I mean, like, in terms, hearing Smashing Pumpkins labelled as alternative, that's when I was at school, that's exactly what they were. They were the alternative to what was on the radio, to what was mainstream. And it was like, right, if you don't like that, you'll probably like this. And all the, you know, the grunge bands, the Seattle bands, like some of the, like, I got into heavier music in my teenage years at the same time as Britpop was happening. I was kind of had that kind of parallel track in terms of I liked what was going on topically, you know, because like it was in the news, it was everywhere, like music was everywhere, but then there was all of this other stuff going on which I found equally as interesting, you know, Nirvana, Green Day, Sonic Youth, Smashing Pumpkins, all of those kind of bands. It was all happening at the same time. Do you know what I mean?
There was I have very clear memories of that time, because there was times at school you would get the ones who were into rock music, and they'd always hang out at lunchtime just listening to music and like discussing it. I was a lot of the time out playing football, and I'd sort of walk past and I'd hear the odd song. I remember in my first year of secondary school, so this is 94, I remember somebody with a song that had all these swear words in, and it absolutely blew my mind. You know, I was 11 years old. I haven't really heard that many swear words in a song, certainly not the aggressiveness and all the rock and the guitars and the way they were playing it. Turns out it was The Offspring and Smash.
All right, okay.
And you know, that album, again, after that time I didn't listen to it for a long time, until pretty much adulthood, and then I started to get back into some of those old albums that evoked all of these memories from being back at school. So yeah, I can imagine that I probably might have liked Smashing Pumpkins back in 95, but I just didn't, you know,
weren't exposed to it.
Yeah, weren't exposed to it. It's a completely different era. Unless you had a physical copy of something back then, you never heard this stuff. You know, I grew up in a household where my dad had Fleetwood Mac Rumours. He had he had Phil Collins. You know, he was big in the 80s. He had some Dire Straits stuff. So I know those sort of artists so well. I know, you know, Rumours, the Fleetwood Mac album so well, because my dad used to play it all of the time, and you're sort of exposed to that sort of thing. And I remember my parents also had on CD, when CDs were there, they had the greatest hits albums. There was one in blue and one in white, I think, of the Beatles, or no, one in blue and one in red. Yeah. And that was my whole exposure to the Beatles, until pretty much streaming, to be honest, because I didn't have a copy of Sgt. Pepper's, I didn't have a copy of Revolver or anything like that. So you know all of those hits, you know those 40-50 songs that were on that CD very well. Outside of that, you know, you fall down a little bit. So I think if I had this 1001 albums book, you know, 15 years ago, it wouldn't have helped me. I wouldn't have been able to actually listen to a lot of this stuff. But now you can go on this massive journey and listen to pretty much everything in there, and stuff that you just wouldn't have had the opportunity to growing up.
Alex, it's been a pleasure. And
always.
I'll see you in the office tomorrow. All right, chap.
I'll just be listening to music.
Take care, Yos. Right.
Have fun.
Awesome stuff. Really enjoyed that conversation. Alex is such a great guy. He's one of those people that you can just have a limitless conversation about music with, as we often do. I've spoken to him a lot about bits and pieces over the last 10 years of working with him. Really glad that we got to have that conversation, because it's one that I've really wanted to kind of, you know, get under the skin of with him for quite some time. So that's it for this week. There's a few things coming up. I'm going to see Gaz Coombs this weekend. He's playing in Nottingham. He has a new album out. And the plan is for me to have a conversation with my good friends Tom Eve and Tim Carter about that album. And no doubt that conversation will be peppered with a few insights from the gig that I go to. So lots of podcasts coming up. I've sent a few messages out on via Instagram to people that I'd like to have conversations with. But if you are a listener and you would like to have a conversation, please get in touch. I'd love to have a chat. If you've got any recommendations of music that I could and should be listening to, please let me know. Please get in touch via Instagram or via YouTube or whatever. I'd love to hear from you. So yeah, another episode in the bag, more in the post. Please get involved at Wing Magma on Instagram, at Wing Magma on YouTube. Go over to Spotify and search for the Wing Magma podcast to find more episodes, or do the same on YouTube. And I hope to see you in the not too distant future. Take care. Speak soon.